It's Sunday, February 20, 2022. Welcome to the second episode in a new series from Midas Touch and 5 Minute News called The Weekend Show. Thank you for your incredible response and comments and reviews for our first episode last weekend. Your support has blown my tiny mind. And don't forget to subscribe to the daily 5 Minute News audio podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is Dr. Caroline Orbueno, a behavioral scientist and postdoctoral research associate at the University of Maryland, who studies cognitive security with a focus on misinformation and online influence. And also foreign correspondent Sarah Firth, who's been in Ukraine since the 8th of January and has been on the front lines near the occupied territories in the east. She joins us today from Donbass, which is also currently has the potential to come under attack. Caroline, Sarah, thank you for joining us on The Weekend Show.
Thank you for having me.
So 3 topics that we looked at through the week on 5 Minute News. Back on the 17th of February, that was Thursday, we looked at the virus rules diminishing as the CDC records improved infection rates. Story for the United States there. On Friday the 18th, we looked at Donald Trump and his 2 eldest children who now must testify in a New York case. They're going to give deposition within 21 days, the judge has ruled. So we'll look at that in just a moment. But I first want to start with Ukraine. Sarah, you're in Ukraine. The story today is that the separatist shelling in Ukraine has renewed fears of an invasion. And Joe Biden has warned that Russia could invade within days. And violence has now spiked this long-running standoff that some worry could provide a wider conflict. So you're in Donbass, but you were in Kyiv before. So tell us where you're at and how things are happening for you right now.
So I spent the last couple of months on various front lines around the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk. And I've also visited the port city of Mariupol, which is a pretty key area for Ukraine as well. I've embedded with the military overnight, so I spent a good amount of time with the soldiers. And now we are about 30 kilometers from the front lines with Donetsk, the occupied territory. It's a pretty tense moment tonight that you've caught me at, because obviously for the country right now, there's a real sense of just how serious this is potentially about to get. We're seeing some of those key indicators that the likes of the US President and the US Secretary of State have laid out in very clear terms that they've assessed that Russia might take. And now we're seeing some of that over the last few days actually playing out on the ground here in the east.
Sarah, I think people don't really realize the scale of Ukraine. It's the largest country in Europe outside of Russia, with 41 million people there. And the consequences of an invasion of 170,000 Russian troops who are currently amassed at the border would be significant for regular Ukrainians. But uniquely, they have the support of the West, and NATO, of course, would effectively be the enemy to Russia with the support of China. So how do Ukrainians feel about having this support from the likes of Joe Biden?
I mean, that support's been absolutely critical, and I think the messaging coming from the US has really bolstered the forces on the front line. And of course, that those words have been backed up by action. You've seen US military aid coming in significant quantities, and that is absolutely desperately needed. I think there's perhaps a sense that some of this has come a little bit too late. You speak to the soldiers on the front line and they say, we feel like the world has just woken up to this conflict that's been going on for 8 years now. And now you've seen this Russian military buildup on the borders, and this threat has gotten to this sort of the brink, basically, the brink of a war that we didn't expect to see in this time, in this day and age. And the last 8 years, these soldiers, we've spent so much time with them. I've embedded with the Ukrainian military. These front lines are trench warfare. They've been fighting in trenches for the last 8 years. So that's the sort of level of experience. It's a very capable, very organized military. It's not the military of 2014, but there are these huge vulnerabilities when it comes to their defense capabilities, and in particular when it comes to aviation and naval defense. And so were we actually to see the kind of escalation and a full-scale invasion of the type, the worst-case scenario type that we've heard the US President and the US Secretary of State talking about just over the last few days, Ukraine remains extremely vulnerable. And I think there is a big question mark over what happens then. You know, one soldier I spoke to said Ukraine is the forepost of Europe. So what happens here in Ukraine now isn't just going to affect Ukrainians. There is a real sense amongst a lot of people, not just the soldiers that you speak to, that this is Russia conducting diplomacy with a gun to Ukraine's head, to Europe's head, to NATO's head, and that potentially they're going to be able to continue to carry out this kind of aggression and this threatening behavior for quite an extended period if something significant doesn't change.
Sarah, let's just talk for a second about Vladimir Putin, because he's kind of on the back foot here, isn't he? If he is forced to go to war, this will cost him a fortune. And many people say that Russia is, practically bankrupted anyway. His money is not in the Kremlin. It's spread all around the world in oligarchs' bank accounts. So he probably isn't. He's clearly using this troop build-up as an opportunity to push leverage. He really doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. That's fundamentally what this is all about, isn't it?
It is, yes. And I mean, I think in terms of, again, sort of assessing the situation as it's progressed over the last couple of months, perhaps that aim has potentially been achieved. I don't think, speaking to a lot of Western analysts, that the question of NATO membership at any time in the near future now is pushed even further back given the current situation. But that being said, I mean, I think it is really important to note that all the Ukrainians that we've spoken to have dealt with this ongoing conflict for 8 years now. And it's never been this serious. We've never seen troops built up, the Russian troop build-up of this type. And again, it's up until now, it's been trench warfare. But if worst-case predictions come true, this is a conflict on a totally different scale, and Ukrainians remain extremely vulnerable. And there's not panic here, but there is a sort of psychological element to this as well, where you ask people about dates of when a potential invasion could start, and they'll tell you it doesn't really matter if it's tomorrow or the day after or next week or next year. The point is that right now Russia can do this. And in 2014, they did invade. They've occupied territory in Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk for the last 8 years. They annexed Crimea. And so those warnings coming from the US about the potential targeting from the air, the extension of those occupied territories, the targeting perhaps of the port city of Mariupol, there is a real concern that an attack of that type might fall under the threshold of the type of international sanctions that would be needed to deter Russia from doing this. So I think there is a sense, no one knows what is going on inside Putin's head right now. And you ask people here, do you think, the soldiers, do you think he's going to do this? And they will tell you, all we know is that Russia has been doing this for the last 8 years. There is verified information about Russian support to those separatist areas. And we've seen now very clear steps that have been taken despite lines and talks of de-escalation. That is not what's happening on the ground right now. What's happening on the ground right now is that over the last few days, we've seen an uptick in attacks. And that is deeply, deeply concerning for the Ukrainians here in the country as to what that means and what the next few days might hold.
Okay. Sarah, thank you. I'll let you get back because I know that it's late there and you need to be safe. But I appreciate you joining us on the Weekend Show.
Thank you so much for your patience, Anthony. Take care.
Caroline, let me ask you, how different do you think, we'll just stay with Ukraine just for a couple of minutes, how do you think this might have played out slightly differently if Donald Trump was still the president of the United States? Because, famously he sided with Putin. He asked Volodymyr Zelensky to investigate Hunter Biden. I mean, his whole attitude to this region was from a very different standpoint. He doesn't really know world politics, does he? It was all about how things affect him. So how might have it been different for us here in the US and for the people of Ukraine if President Trump was still the man in charge?
On the one hand, I think we all saw that much of the world, including Ukraine and Russia, did not really see Trump as having Ukraine's back, and really, didn't. If a situation like this had happened, I think there would have been a lot of questions among Ukrainians whether the U.S. really would have had their back, and whether we would have, been the allies that we have promised to be. And I think also, on the other hand, Russia would have known that the support from the U.S. may not be as solid, and certainly that could embolden Putin to invade or be more aggressive than he may be in other circumstances. There's another side, though, to the story, which is that because of all of that, I think Americans were paying more attention to Ukraine and Russia, because we knew that we didn't necessarily have a president who would have a solid policy. And so a lot of us felt like, we needed to pay closer attention, because if the president wasn't going to step up, somebody did. And I think now what we're seeing is first of all, there's just so much going on right now. We're still in a pandemic. There's a lot going on politically. There's a lot going on globally. And I think that can also have the effect of emboldening someone like Putin if they feel like there is an opportunity, when people are distracted, when people are not focused in on that conflict, that that can be used as as a vulnerability, and may in fact be one of the reasons that this time was chosen to potentially invade Ukraine again.
Because Trump famously took the US out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and was very keen to remove the US from NATO as well. And of course, this is a potential war between Russia and NATO, not Russia and the US. So it could have got to the point, I presume, that the US wouldn't have even been part of the Allied forces.
Yeah, that was obviously one of the kind of the most startling things about Trump's presidency in terms of foreign policy, was his his criticism of NATO, his lack of support for U.S. participation in NATO, and I think there are still lingering effects of that among some Republicans in the U.S. I think we still see that the support for NATO, the support for U.S. Involvement in NATO, is not as strong as it once was among Republicans. And I think if Donald Trump were still president, I think there would be questions about sort of how involved the U.S. would be, and whether he would kind of take Putin's point of view that, Ukraine is in Russia's backyard, and, what's America doing over here? And, I think we would probably hear some of that echoed by Trump if he were still in office.
Do you think it's fair to say that the reason that he wanted to withdraw troops from all active service around the world, obviously we know about Afghanistan, but he was very keen to remove peacekeeping troops from anywhere and everywhere, including, in Germany, is because really he didn't know anything about foreign policy. He didn't really understand what diplomacy was about. And actually it would be easier for him if he didn't have any troops seeing active service, because it meant that he could focus on his America First policy. And then you had that contradiction of him boasting that America had the biggest, most powerful military in the world, and yet he wanted to bring them all home.
I think it's probably a combination of things. I think, I don't think he really understood or understands policy in general. I think he was being advised by people who had very strong worldviews and very strong ideologies, including some who had sort of isolationist, nationalist viewpoints. And I think that had a lot to do with, his wanting to pull the U.S. out of all of our involvement, whether it was in conflict or in peace. And, I think look at people like Steve Bannon, who really advocate for those more isolationist, protectionist policies, nationalist policies. And, I think a good part of the Republican base found that appealing. And I think, our involvement in conflicts like in Afghanistan, how long that lasted, I think it makes it appealing to think about, just kind of withdrawing from all of those, potential situations. And I think there are people who believe, I think incorrectly, that the situation in Ukraine is a parallel or, would be a new Afghanistan. I don't think that is at all a good comparison. They're very different situations. We're not nation building, for one thing, in Ukraine. But, I think Trump had advisors who were telling him certain things, who, were advocating their worldviews. And I think he didn't necessarily, have a counterpoint to that. And I don't think he necessarily, understood that situation enough to have a counterpoint of his own.
I don't like this to be the Donald Trump show, but I also recognize that to ignore him and to think that because he's not in office, he's gone away is foolish when you're talking about somebody who's so drastically changed the face of America. And not just for Americans with the division here, but also the viewpoint of America from around the world, because the rest of the world relied on America's democracy and diplomacy in order to build their own democracies and diplomacy. And so with it being so fractious here and him being so critical of other nations without really understanding them, how much damage do you think that did to America on the world stage?
I think pretty significant. If you read world news, from other countries, and certainly talk to people in Europe and much of the rest of the world, there is kind of a feeling that we're still not the U.S. they remember and thought we were. I think there's, a sense of kind of uncertainty, if in situations, like Ukraine and certainly other foreign policy related situations, I think there's just a lot of questions about sort of, well, you're not the country we thought you were. So what decisions are you going to make now? In the past, we kind of, we thought you were a predictable country. We thought we understood the decision making and could kind of count on you to make, certain decisions in certain situations. And I think there's a lot of questions now about whether, we can be counted on, and are we the allies that people thought we were? And, when we enter into a treaty or a pact with other countries, can we be counted on? Because there's been a long-standing agreement that, certain treaties and certain pacts would endure regardless of the presidency, and that, a new president could come in and may have different views and certainly different foreign policies, but that, if we agreed to something, that we would hold up our end of the agreement. And I think, there is some uncertainty among, around the world about whether that is still the case. And, I don't think that's irreparable damage. I think we can, restore confidence again, but I think it's going to take, I think we're basically going to have to prove ourselves that, that we are the country that some of our allies believed we were and would like us to be. And I think, in whether it's Ukraine or, the Paris Climate Agreement, I think we're just going to have to show that when we say we will do something, we will do it. And over time, I hope that we can restore the confidence that I do think was lost over the past 5-6 years.
Donald Trump and 2 of his children have been ordered by a New York judge to appear for a deposition within the next 3 weeks. It's part of this investigation over alleged fraud in the valuation of assets belonging to the family business. And I speak to a lot of people about these investigations. Of course, there's, the Southern District of New York, Letitia James, but there's also the District of Manhattan that's investigating him, as well as the arguably the Justice Department as well. They've got a lot to look at now, also off the back of the January 6 insurrection committee. But is Donald Trump above the law? I mean, do people like him get caught? Do they go to prison? Do they serve time? Or do they just keep getting away with it? Because this is going to be a landmark moment for the types of people. There's plenty of other Donald Trump characters out there. So do you think that justice will ever catch up with him?
Yesterday, when they announced that Trump would have to sit for a deposition and his 2 eldest kids, the New York AG Letitia James said, that this was an indication that he's not above the law, and I certainly think it's a good step. This is one of. It feels like in recent days there have been a few things. He got dropped. His Trump organization got dropped by their long-term accounting firm. Then we had the news about the deposition. It seems like maybe one other thing that I'm forgetting, but
he put out a statement, didn't he, that completely contradicted the statement of his accountancy firm from the day before.
Correct.
And that he effectively perjured himself by, he obviously didn't know what they had said, and so he then said something completely different. He's almost saying to the Justice Department, it was me. Come and get me. Come and arrest me. Here I am. I'm the one that did it. Come and get me. And yet people are complaining that Merrick Garland and the Justice Department is like, well, yes, we're going to investigate this. We're going to find out who it is and what the problem is. And Trump's like, it's me. I told you it was me. I'm over here. And yet still he seems to evade the law. And when we're talking about authoritarianism and we're talking about the rise of fascism, there's a lot more resting on this than just a few idiosyncrasies with his tax filings. Is that right?
Yes. And, I think one of the things you're seeing with Merrick Garland and the Justice Department is sort of this weighing of, on the one hand, we have these norms about, former presidents and, executive privilege and not coming across as if you're, going after your political opponents. But then on the other hand, we do have these values and principles that, nobody's above the law, that if you break the law, that, you will face consequences regardless of who you are and how much money you have and how powerful you are. And I think ultimately, they're kind of trying to figure out that balance. And, arguably either one, I think we do have those norms about, former presidents sort of being not above the law, but in a little bit of a different position just because of what types of decisions they have to make. Now, again, with Trump, that's a little bit different because a lot of the things we're talking about are not actually, they're not actually related to his duties as a president. They're related to his private business that, he had before and during his presidency. So I do think that, that's an important detail to acknowledge, that the reason we generally see, former presidents and current presidents get some exceptions made in certain circumstances is when it deals with their duties as president, not their business as private individuals.
But a lot of presidents previously were politicians, weren't they? So they've been in public service, they've been governors, or they've served in some, even in the military in some cases. Trump was a fake billionaire and a reality TV show host. So should the rules change for this guy? Like, should the Attorney General be not looking upon him as being, because he wasn't even a 2-term president, he was a 1-term president who was impeached twice. So should the rules be different for him? Because there's a lot of people that say that Merrick Garland is just, he was a Trump appointee, let's not forget, that he is just going to be too soft on this entire movement. I mean, it's not just one man, is it? Trump famously said the other week at a Texas rally, they're not after me, they're after you.
Yeah. On the one hand, you are correct. Trump came from a very unconventional background. He was a very unconventional president. On the other hand, one of the again, I think it goes to weighing sort of where, on the one hand, we can't become a country that says, when you're president, that means you can't break the law and anything you do is legal by default because you're president. I mean, that obviously can't be the case. On the other hand, given the partisanship of our country right now, I don't think now is the time either to roll back some of those longstanding norms of not going after sitting or former presidents for their business as president. And again, I think that's where the distinction comes in with Trump, is that a lot of the things, not all, but a lot of the things we are talking about that are being investigated have to do with him as a private individual, as a business owner. And I think that is in a very different, just a different category of legality or illegality.
Sure. I mean, he lied about kind of letting go of the Trump organization, didn't he? Like, famously, when he took office, he said, I'm not going to have anything to do with the business anymore. And then as time went on, it became clear that actually he hadn't let go at all. And he was still making every decision at the Trump organization. And he was still trying to, in fact, take advantage of the presidency to grow his business. And there's all sorts of information coming out now about $375,000 that was paid from the Make America Great campaign to pay for office space in Trump Tower. I mean, there's a lot of corruption there, and Michael Cohen, I guess, his former fixer, is going to be key to a lot of this, and that's in fact what Letitia James's office is saying, that it's really Michael Cohen's statements that have been the lead for a lot of this. And I actually have a lot of time for Michael Cohen now. I thought of him as a baddie back then, but he really seems like he's repented now, and he recognizes that he was just in with the wrong crowd, and now he's spilling the beans. There's one statistic I want to run by you, which I'm interested in your opinion on, and that is that 70%, this was a poll that was done a couple of days ago, 70% of Republicans, the Republican lawmakers, believe that the election of 2020 was fraudulent and was taken away from Donald Trump, and that Joe Biden should not be the legitimate president. Do you think they actually believe that, or are they just saying that because they're still under the power of their supreme leader?
I do think a fair number of them, particularly when you're talking about elected Republicans and sort of pundits and influencers, I think a fair number of them don't necessarily believe it, but that idea that the election was stolen has become somewhat of a litmus test. And if you're not willing to get behind that idea, it's very hard at the moment to be, to have a role in that sort of pro-Trump Republican Party. And so I think a lot of them, are politically savvy. That's how they got where they are in the first place. And I think a lot of them recognize that they have to say that, and that's, if they don't say that they're either going to get voted out, or, in the case of a pundit or whatever, they lose half their audience. And I think they recognize that that's what the pro-Trump Republican voters want to hear right now. And so they'll say that. Sort of it,
but they're choosing a falsehood, or a lie. I hate the word falsehood. We used to use that word, and now it's just like people say lies. They're choosing lies over democracy. It's almost as if the very fabric of America is the free vote, a fair and free election. There was no election fraud. It's been checked and checked and rechecked. And yet they are still prepared to put the entire fabric of the nation at risk just to side with Trump and just to own the libs.
Well, they're also prepared to make it harder for millions of people to vote, to redistrict things so that it's easier for them to win and, consolidate voters in certain districts to make it basically impossible for a Democratic challenger to beat them in in some of the local races. And, I think some of them, probably don't necessarily recognize quite how harmful what they're doing is and quite how harmful it is when you, devalue truth and treat information more like it is a weapon rather than a tool for knowledge or enlightenment. And but I think a fair number of them are, fierce ideologues, are fierce partisans, and they feel like they're, if that's what it takes, that's what they're going to do. And, that's the part that is probably the most disturbing, the most frightening, is that there are people who I think are, fully aware of how damaging it is to lie about something like an election, the legitimacy of an election, and who are, willing to do it anyway because that's what they think it will take to win.
But they're effectively burning down the republic. And I've often said that actually Republicans shouldn't be called Republicans. They should be called, I don't know, America First or whatever Trump's new movement could be called. And actually Democrats should be called Republicans because they're the ones who want to maintain the republic and maintain the democracy. And so, are we at a point now where democracy is just exclusive to Democrats? And actually it's something that Republicans have just let go of. The idea of a fair election is irrelevant to them now anyway.
I mean, I think, with Trump becoming such a large part of the Republican Party, I think that the pro-Trump GOP that exists today, it does largely exist at odds with a lot of the, fundamental tenets of democracy, starting with valuing and caring about truth and I think I wouldn't necessarily say it's exclusive to Democrats, but right now Democrats are the only party that is still working to uphold those values that that many of us have come to know and love. And I think there are people out there who don't identify as Democrats who are still, pro-democracy. There are people out there who, certainly used to be Republican voters who probably aren't anymore, who would identify as pro-democracy. But, I think right now the Republican Party as an institution is largely working in the direction of, eroding democracy. And, I think that in of itself, a one-party system is not a healthy way to function in a democracy. And that's, that in and of itself is a danger. And, I think that's something that we're going to have to wrangle with sooner rather than later, because it does not seem like Trump's grip on the Republican Party is really going away. Maybe that will change with 2024. We'll see. But right now, it certainly doesn't seem to be changing.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like we are living in the media's world. The media brought us Donald Trump, and the media has supported his desire to divide. And the media looks at Twitter, as you say, and takes that as read. And the reality is most people are not on Twitter. In fact, most Republicans don't watch Fox News. I think they only get like 3 million viewers a week. It's not these kind of monolithic institutions that we think they are. And in fact, society can exist very nicely without any of this stuff. And so, I actually have hope. I fear 2024 because I don't quite know how legally that's going to look in terms of the election. You might find a lot of people just like, I'm not going to vote, it's fraud, and that's how they'll start. But that's a shame because I would like Republicans to vote in as many numbers as Democrats because I believe in democracy. So, I have hope that actually we'll come through this, but I recognize that the media don't seem to be learning. And you only need to look at, Spotify and Joe Rogan and these types of situations to see that really the lessons have not been learned. And if Trump was to return, hypothetically, that the media would again enjoy all of the profit that he brought these networks, because people didn't really watch these channels before him. They were just on in the gym or they were on in a hotel, but people didn't really watch these networks religiously like when he was this freak show, what's he going to say next? And they encouraged that. And so, I think that's why a lot of independent journalists that have really tried and trailblaze their own path and not give credence to these fabricated stories or these opinions that suddenly become the news. I think life's going to be fine. I'm trying to end on a hopeful note because I really want us to be, positive. And I do and I just trust people. I actually think that people are fundamentally born good. And I feel like there is still an inherent goodness in this country. I'm very grateful to you for joining me today. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
And hopefully we'll chat with you again sometime. My thanks to Dr. Caroline Orbueno and to Sarah Firth. And don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube and also the 5 Minute News daily audio podcast, which drops in the early hours every morning. So it's there when you wake up and you can listen to it whilst you make your morning coffee. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next Sunday morning with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.